There's something almost unsettling about Ananta when you first see it, not because it looks bad, actually it's the opposite. It looks too ambitious, too dense, too alive. Like someone took GTA city scale, Spider-Man's movement, Yakuza's street level chaos, anime aesthetics, and just said, yeah, put it all in. And the immediate reaction a lot of people had wasn't excitement, it was suspicion. This looks expensive, this looks overwhelming, this looks impossible to pull off. But the reaction is exactly why Ananta is so interesting. Because whether Ananta ends up being great or a complete mess doesn't actually matter as much as what it reveals. The fact that a game like this feels shocking tells you something is deeply wrong with Western AAA. Not in the sense that they're creatively bankrupt, but they're more risk-averse, overmanaged, and terrified of anything that doesn't fit neatly into a proven template. Ananta doesn't feel like a revolution, it feels like a reminder. A reminder of what big games used to be like, what they used to try before budgets, before shareholders, before brand safety turned ambition into liability. And when you look at it through that lens, Ananta stops being anime GTA and starts becoming a mirror, one that reflects everything Western AAA has quietly trained itself not to do anymore. One of the most common reactions to Ananta wasn't that it looked bad or ugly or derivative, it was that it looked too busy, too much going on, too many people, too many systems. And one word keeps coming up, overwhelming. But that reaction says more about what we've been conditioned to expect from Western AAA than it does about Ananta itself. Because Western AAA open worlds today are massive, they're extremely expensive, and they're very technically impressive, yet they often feel strangely sterile. Cities look real, but they don't feel lived in. NPCs exist to fill space, not to create friction between the players. Systems are carefully sandboxed so nothing truly unpredictable happens. You're rarely surprised by the world, you're guided through it. Everything is readable, safe, and controlled, and that's not an accident. That's a design philosophy that Western AAA prioritizes. They prioritize clarity over chaos. It wants players to always understand what's happening, where to go, and what the game expects from them. And on paper, that sounds reasonable, but the side effect is that worlds stop feeling alive and start feeling curated. Like theme parks, beautiful, expensive theme parks where every experience has been stress tested, approved, and optimized to avoid discomfort. Ananta, by contrast, looks like it doesn't care if the city feels messy. Crowds spill everywhere, systems overlap, movement is fast, exaggerated, almost reckless. The city doesn't feel like a backdrop, it feels like something that might get in your way, that might distract you or pull you off course. That's why it feels so overwhelming, not because it's poorly designed, but because it's trying to protect the player from the world. Western AAA used to understand this. Older open world games weren't perfectly balanced or clean, but they felt reactive. You could break things, you could stumble into moments that weren't even scripted. That sense of unpredictability is what made those worlds feel so alive, even when the tech was far worse than they are today. Today, that unpredictability is treated as a liability. Chaos is harder to QA, dense systems are harder to certify, emergent behavior is harder to patch without breaking something else. So studios sand it down, they simplify it, they reduce friction, and in doing so, they drain the world of its energy. Ananta doesn't look alive because it's bigger or prettier, it looks alive because it's willing to be uncomfortable. And the fact that this feels unusual in 2026 is the real indictment, not of Ananta, but of Western AAA design itself. One of the most revealing things about Ananta is how shameless it is. It doesn't hide its influences, it doesn't pretend it's invented swinging through a city, or stylish brawling, or dense urban sandboxes. It wears all of that on its sleeves and just goes for it. And that alone already puts it at odds with how Western AAA operates. Because Western AAA doesn't really do new anymore, not in any meaningful way. Innovation in that space usually means iteration inside an existing brand, a sequel that refines movement, a reboot that modernizes a tone, a bold new direction that still has to fit the expectations of a logo, a fandom, and a decade of accumulated baggage. New ideas aren't allowed to exist on their own, they have to justify themselves as extensions of something already proven. That's IP paralysis. When a project costs hundreds of millions of dollars, originality becomes a risk to be managed rather than a goal to pursue. Every mechanic has to be defensible in a meeting. Every design choice has to align with brand identity. Every deviation from the norm has to answer the question, what if this alienates our core audience? And slowly, the game stops being designed for players and starts being designed for approval. Ananta flips that logic. It doesn't ask for permission, it doesn't soften its edges to fit into a legacy brand. It's maximalist remix, unapologetically pulling from everywhere and trusting that cohesion can emerge through energy and tone, rather than strict identity rules. That kind of confidence is something Western AAA has largely trained itself out of. What's ironic is that Western AAA still markets itself as cinematic, ambitious, and boundary pushing, while functionally sticking to the safest possible structures. The result is a generation of games that look incredible but feel strangely familiar within minutes. You know the rhythms, you know the systems, you know where the design will and won't let you go. Ananta, for all its risk, doesn't feel like that. It feels reckless, and recklessness is exactly what Western AAA just can't afford anymore. Just look at Ubisoft. Not because it lacks talents or ideas, but because its entire production culture punishes deviation. So when people look at Ananta and say, oh, this looks like too much, what they're really saying is, this doesn't look approved. And that tells you everything about how narrow Western AAA's creative lane has become. Ananta looks expensive. That's one of the first things everyone notices. The city density, the animation work, the sheer number of systems all stacked on top of each other. It looks like a game that should cost a fortune. And that's exactly why it feels so strange when you compare it to Western AAA, because Western AAA already spends this kind of money and somehow feels safer than ever. That's the paradox. In theory, massive budgets should enable experimentation, more resources, more time, more rooms to try things. But in practice, Western AAA budgets have created a culture where every design decision has to be justified in financial terms. When something costs too much, failure stops becoming a learning experience and starts being a career-ending event. And once that happens, fun itself becomes too risky. So Western AAA shifts towards things that are predictable. Visual fidelity, cinematic presentation, realism, emotional beats delivered through cutscenes. These are impressive, measurable, and easy to sell. You can point to them in a trailer and say, this is where all the money went. What you can't easily justify is playful excess. Systems that exist just because they're entertaining, mechanics that overlap in messy ways, features that don't obviously serve the main loop but make the world feel richer. Those are hard to defend when the budget spreadsheet is already terrifying. Ananta looks like it's spending money in the opposite direction, not just on polish but on density, on motion, on systems colliding with each other. It feels like a game that wants you to play in its world, not just move through it towards the next narrative beat. That doesn't mean it will succeed, but it does mean it's prioritizing a different set of design values. Western AAA didn't lose its ability to make fun games. It boxed itself into a production model where fun is something you add after everything else is approved, and by then it's usually too late. So when people look at Ananta and say this looks like a lot, they're not wrong. But the real question is why Western AAA stopped believing that a lot was worth doing in the first place. One of the strangest parts of the reaction to Ananta is how quickly skepticism around monetization shows up. People immediately assume there's a catch, a gacha system, aggressive paywalls, psychological traps hiding under the surface. And to be fair, that caution isn't irrational, but it didn't come from nowhere. Of course, Chinese games are known for having aggressive gacha systems. However, I'd say Western AAA is more of the culprit in training players to think this way. For years, the Western AAA model has drifted towards double or triple dipping. You pay full price up front, then you nudge towards season passes, cosmetic stores, battle passes, timed event, limited time bundles, layers of monetizations stacked on top of a premium purchase. Even games that aren't technically live service borrow the language and psychology of live service designs. Engagement becomes a metric, retention becomes a priority, and design decisions quietly shift to serve those goals. You compare that directly with Chinese games, for example, Where Winds Meet. The game is entirely free, and all the systems within it exist for free. Every expansion, every gameplay update, then gacha and cosmetics and expensive boats all come as an optional extra for those who truly love the game. The result of Western AAA's decisions in monetization is that players no longer trust their intent. When a Western AAA developer, for example Activision, introduces a system, the first question isn't, is this fun? It's, what's this setting me up to buy later? That erosion of trust didn't happen overnight. It was cultivated. Now contrast that with Ananta's positioning. It's presented as free to play, with monetization focused on customization, outfits, vehicles, housing, rather than pay to win progression. That doesn't automatically make it virtuous by any means. Free to play always comes with a few trade-offs, and it's smart to stay skeptical. But the perception difference does matter. Western AAA charges you $70 and it still feels like it's negotiating with you afterwards. Ananta asks you for nothing upfront and immediately gets treated as suspicious. That inversion says everything about how badly Western AAA damaged its relationship with its audience. What's ironic is that many AAA studios justify aggressive monetization by pointing to rising costs. The same rising costs that supposedly force them to play it safe creatively. And yet, those monetization strategies often end up making games feel more constrained, more padded, and less honest. Ananta hasn't earned their trust yet. Yes, NetEase has been on a generational run so far, but it still has to prove itself with every release. But the fact that people are hoping it isn't predatory, while expecting Western AAA to be, reveals how low the bar has fallen. And once players stop giving you the benefit of the doubt, no amount of polish can buy the trust back. Again, just look at Ubisoft. The word that keeps following Ananta around is overwhelming. And unlike the other criticisms, this one actually matters. Because this is the point where excitement and skepticism intersect, and where the entire argument could collapse if you're not careful. Ananta is doing a lot. Movement systems, combat styles, city density, customization, tonal shifts. It's all being thrown at the player at once. That ambition is what makes it stand out, but it also could be what breaks it. There's a real risk that this becomes a Frankenstein game, shallow versions of great ideas stitched together without the depth to sustain them. Western AAA avoids this problem by narrowing scope, and to be fair, that restraint often results in polish, but it also results in sameness. Ananta is choosing the opposite trade-off: breadth first, cohesion later. That is dangerous, but it is also how some of the most memorable games in history were made. And even in recent history, Where Winds Meet is this extremely ambitious game with dozens of systems that shouldn't work on paper, but end up being extremely cohesive. There's no reason why Ananta, that's also published by NetEase, can't do the exact same thing. But if those elements don't interlock, if they exist in parallel rather than conversation, the game risks feeling disjointed rather than alive. And then there's the trailer problem. Trailers are curated, they show peak moments, ideal conditions, systems working in harmony. Western AAA has trained us to be wary of that too. We've seen vertical slices sell fantasies that the final product couldn't sustain for more than a few hours. So yes, Ananta could absolutely fail. It could be too unfocused, too shallow, too chaotic to maintain long-term engagement. But here's a crucial point. Even that failure would be instructive. Because Western AAA didn't stop taking risks because risks stopped working. It stopped because failure became unacceptable. Ananta is reminding us what it looks like when a studio is still willing to gamble, when ambition hasn't been completely filtered through fear. And if overwhelming is the cost of that ambition, then maybe the problem isn't that Ananta is doing too much. Maybe it's that Western AAA forgot how to do anything without asking for permission first. Whether Ananta ends up being great or completely falls apart, it already did something Western AAA hasn't managed in years. It made people stop and feel something: excitement, suspicion, curiosity, even disbelief. And the fact that a single trailer could provoke that range of reaction tells you how starved that space has become. Ananta doesn't expose Western AAA because it's perfect. It exposes it because it's trying to be loud, trying to be messy, trying to be more than a neatly managed product, designed to survive a boardroom. Western AAA still has that talent, the money, and the technology to make games like this, but it no longer has production culture that allows them to exist. If Ananta succeeds, it proves that limits Western AAA keeps citing, scope, density, creativity, systemic chaos, were never technical constraints, they were institutional ones. Self-imposed rules built around risk management, IP protection, and shareholder comfort. And if Ananta falls, the lesson is just as uncomfortable. It means the audience is still willing to root for ambition, even when it's dangerous. It means players would rather see a game reach too far than watch another perfectly polished iteration that never surprises them. Ananta isn't a blueprint, it's a stress test, a reminder that safe and good are not the same thing, and that somewhere along the way, Western AAA started treating them as if they were. And that's the real exposure.